Right now, thousands from across this country marched on Washington this weekend calling for comprehensive gun legislation. But even with all that public support, will reform remain elusive? And immigration taking center stage as a bipartisan group of senators unveiled their proposal to bring our immigration system into the 21st century. Past attempts have failed. The question is, will this one do the trick? And later, one football player says that the NFL will cease to exist in 30 years. We'll tell you why he thinks so. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thanks so much for joining us this Monday evening, January 28th. Now, the subject of guns, it was on my mind yesterday. Now, ever since the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School over a month ago now, guns, they've had a rare moment in the legislative limelight. We'll see what happens, but at least the national consciousness is, I think, on this overdue debate. Today, the president, he met with police chiefs from cities that saw mass killings just in the year 2012. And over the weekend, families from Newtown, they joined thousands of others from around the country in a march on Washington. And meanwhile, back in Connecticut, 26 copper stars, they were dedicated in a ceremony at the Sandy Hook fire station. But even with all that as a backdrop, many believe that change will once again remain elusive. Despite public support for reasonable gun safety legislation, comprehensive reform is regarded by people on both sides of the aisle as unlikely. Why? Well, in large part because of the powerful gun lobby and a lack, I think, of some in Washington when it comes to political courage. Now, I saw a movie yesterday that would seemingly have no connection to this subject, but it certainly, I think, puts something into context. I saw the movie Lincoln this weekend. It was a fantastic movie, and I recommend it if you haven't seen it. But in the film, it outlined how that president, in that time, in a moment of deep division against steep legislative odds, and again, against a lot of people on his side and the other telling me he nowhere had near the votes to get something through, was able to make the difficult choices and bring the country into the future. Now, if we could end slavery in America, for crying out loud, the question is, can we pass gun safety legislation? Different times, but still same test when it comes to moral and political courage. And joining us to sound off on this topic and everything else tonight, Michael Balboni, former New York State Senator and Assemblyman. He's also the former Deputy Secretary for Public Safety for the state of New York. Dominic Carter, as always, political journalist and author, and a senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. Guys, thanks for joining us. You know, sitting through the film yesterday, and everybody of his closest supporters in his cabinet at the time with Lincoln said, listen, keep your eye on the ball here. We can end this war here. Don't try and pass the 13th Amendment here. You don't have nearly the votes. In this case, the Democrats that they needed to come on board and support the Republicans for supporting the abolition of slavery. And they said, well, the country's just not ready for it yet. Maybe do little steps here, but don't go all the way. And how familiar it sounds to the conversation that we have today in Washington. And every poll, we just showed them, they might say public believes in a ban on assault weapons. They believe that ammo clips should be tightened to a certain number here. They believe that we ought to have background checks for every gun, and we ought to have a database so that regardless of what state you are in this country, we know if somebody walks in who this person is, whether they're nuts, whether they're a felon, whatever. We at least know who's who. And we can keep track of it so that we can actually try and solve some of these crimes. But yet today, a betting man would say, you're not going to get through half that stuff. Shoot small or aim small here and maybe you might accomplish it. And I hear it so often, I kind of buy into it. And then I see different times in this country, we've had different challenges, even bigger than this. And you got some courage and leadership where people say, to hell with the political consequences. I'm going to, put my marker down here. I'm going to fight for this. You think, instead of listening to the pundits, that the president really went hard to the public here, as he says he will, we might be surprised by the outcome?
I think you have, obviously, the huge cultural divide. And I think it's more than just the coast states versus the middle, which is how we tend to look at things. I really think it's rural versus urban. I mean, that's really kind of where this is coming from. If you go to most of the rural places in America, you don't see support for gun control. And yet, I don't think there's many cities in America where there isn't support for gun control. So, and that's a very tough political formula because it cuts against both parties, gets geographically. And then the other thing I think is that what's happening on both sides, as we've talked about beforehand, this is overselling on the one hand, on behalf of the gun rights guys, if you take this away, you're taking away our constitutional rights, we won't be able to do the things we love to do. And on the other hand, that if we pass the things that they're talking about, we would have been able to stop Newtown, which we wouldn't, or we'd be able to take down crime, which it's kind of low to begin with, and there's really no correlation. So I think that the American public sitting here going, where are we on this? And what's really going to make our families safer? And what's everyone? We understand the horror and the carnage, and I think people are still trying to figure it out. That's part of the problem here.
There's an irony in the example that you mentioned with Lincoln, which is that I think it's 13 states, I'm not sure of the exact number, weren't part of that debate because they were off in the Confederacy and not represented in Washington during that debate. And of the people who were there, you had a general consensus, we need to do this in order to end the war. Ironically, if you eliminate those same states, I think gun control would have a much better chance of passing in 2013.
But they argued, Andrew, if you tried to pass this, it would scuttle the plans to end the war, because they said it'd be much easier to end the war without passing this. So he did something which is more politically trying.
But you also had Lincoln's fight was a congressional fight. It was with lawmakers to try to convince them to vote their conscience. Not really, because because we're in a different.
Every poll shows that they support. The American public supports the main thing. Today, you have the police chiefs that were standing there. I can pick out every major constituency here who says nobody's trying to get rid of the Second Amendment. What we're talking about is something that the public supports. This is a congressional fight. They don't represent the will of the American public.
We're in a different era when it comes to the representatives who are in Washington right now, where they are being held with their feet to the fire by the chances of being primaried and by the extreme wing of their party. That's a difference from that era. You also have a scenario where it's problematic. The will of the people and the public opinion isn't reflected in how people are going to vote on this issue when you go forward. Look at immigration, which we're going to get to in our next segment.
No, but what do you mean the public opinion isn't reflective of how people vote?
Of how lawmakers are prepared to vote on this issue.
Well, that to me is, or I think, is the shame out of this, Dominic, because I'm not one of these people, and I think lawmakers said it perfectly. I don't think that all of a sudden you have every single thing on the pages that it would make the crimes go away in this country. But it's a start. And for us to sit back and say, since Sandy Hook, where 26-year-olds were, and they ever said, if you ever showed the pictures from the autopsies from the people that were there, nobody would fight this issue, but we're not going to go there as a country.
They would still fight it.
Maybe,
but go ahead.
But there's a large population would say, my God, wait a minute. But that being said, more than 1,000 people have died at the end of a gun. In this country. And everybody can make legitimate arguments about, well, an abandoned assault weapons won't solve this, or, the background check wouldn't stop lands. We got to do something. And for us to say, throw up our hands and say, what can you really do? I think it's even a little bit more, where you look at who's really the mouthpiece. And to me, let's look at what the NRA has said since this has happened. One, what's their answer? Let's arm the lunch lady. More guns for more people in more schools and more places. That's how we'll stop the bad guy. NRA, what else do? They go out and put out they go after the president with an ad here to say that, because he's got Secret Service protection for his children, somehow, as if that's not even mandated, that's the bad thing. Then there's apps where they show literally designed for children 4 and older, sponsored by the NRA, where they have them shooting at caskets, white caskets, with an assault weapon. And I can keep going on and on. I mean, you saw the Sunday Times here. They're in an ad, they talk about maybe you can be lucky to a child and have an AR-15 under your Christmas tree, the same gun that mowed down all those kids. So you even have the bad guy in this, as far as I'm concerned, where this isn't that tough or courageous a political stand to say, I don't agree with everything the president wants to do here, but I'm willing to move a little bit. I just haven't heard that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Don.
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the things, again, that I think that people fail to really focus on is that there's another piece of this whole debate that nobody's talking about, which is kind of offensive to me. That's mental health. These horrific accidents occur almost by definition by insane people.
Yep.
And yet we're not really talking about how do we do the background check, so we better take a look at not only who has the license, who's around them, who has access to guns in the house. And I've always supported a trigger lock. Why don't we really revisit trigger locks and the pistol grips that
we talked
are
about smart
signature
technology. We were talking about this morning. But imagine you try and propose that.
But those are the practical things that don't take away people's rights on this thing, that in fact enable people to do those kind of things responsibly, more responsibly, and then take away this abhorrent, hideous consequence when you have someone who's mentally ill who gets a hold of a firearm.
But the problem there is that legally, most of these people are mentally well, or considered legally mentally well, until they pull the trigger, at which point, well, they're insane, they've killed all these people. It's almost like you have to prejudge them in order to figure out who are the ones.
Or you could do what we talked about, which is you buy a gun, you accept, I have to maintain a trigger lock on it, or I'm going to have a thumbprint ID, which is I'm buying the gun for me. Yeah. So if I'm deemed I'm either nuts or I'm stable, I got a restraining order against me, I'm a whatever it is, I can't get the gun, right? Because you got a background check. Or if I'm going to buy it, I have to take personal responsibility for it, and I can't say, oh, yeah, my kid was bipolar here and he threatened, he killed the family cat, but how was I supposed to know he was nuts? Kid can't use the gun. I'm just looking for a little bit, little bit of common sense.
The good news, Richard, is that the president you can't govern by just accepting no. Yeah, I mean, you can't do it. So
does he lose anything by trying everything at this?
Well, he's putting his capital on the line right now, but that's why it's commendable what the president and vice president are trying to do. But understand the obstacles are high. The same way that you have this show right now in which you're arguing for more gun control. In southern states, you said rural. Let's add southern to that as well. In southern states, they have similar shows right now as we're on, arguing just the opposite.
We're going to go to break. But you know what? This is exactly what happened when they were fighting about slavery. Where you had places and states that said, it'll destroy the whole economy here. The country's not ready for it yet. Go slow here. And you had people in the party saying, if you did this, you'll never have another job again if you vote for this. It's the same exact thing. But what happened? That president decided to literally go in the back rooms, work deals, do whatever he had to do to get the votes.
Richard, but there was less money involved in politics. And if we're going to be honest, you couldn't buy off politicians as easily back then.
All right, we're going to, I know we're not going to agree on this one, but you know what? Maybe I just expect a little too much, but I do expect more. We're going to jump to a break. When we come back, we're going to turn our issue to arguably the issue of the day, and that's immigration. Believe it or not, Washington might come together on something here. A bipartisan group of senators have unveiled their proposal, one they say could be groundbreaking. We'll tell you what's in the plan. We'll also tell you reactions from it. That's right after this.